medieval kings and their greatest fear: losing their hair. Now, you might be thinking, it's just hair. But for monarchs during this time, it was anything but. Imagine being a king, sitting at the edge of your throne, the weight of an entire kingdom on your shoulders. And all you can think about is whether your hairline is retreating a little too fast. In medieval times, hair was not just a trivial detail. It was a matter of life and death. A king's hair symbolized his strength, virility, and power. So, when that hair started to thin, things got a little uncomfortable. You probably won't survive the stress these rulers faced, not without a crown or a wig anyway. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. I'd love to hear it. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Kings in the Middle Ages understood something that might seem silly to us now. Their hair was crucial. The darker the color, the thicker the strands, the more regal the king appeared. A full, luscious mane was the hallmark of a strong and capable ruler, while a thinning scalp could send the message that ruler was in decline. This wasn't just vanity, it was vital to a monarch's image, for their power and legitimacy rested in part on their appearance. If a king's hair betrayed him, it could bring into question his ability to rule effectively. Baldness was seen as a weakening, a sign that perhaps the ruler wasn't as strong or commanding as he once was. In fact, historians often debate how much of this obsession was linked to the symbolic nature of hair. Was it just about appearance, or did it also reflect deeper cultural beliefs about masculinity, divine favor, or even health? The fear of losing hair extended beyond just kings. It was common for royalty to be scrutinized for every physical flaw, and hair, or the lack of it, was a prime example. Baldness, however, wasn't simply a fashion faux pas in the Middle Ages. No, in this time, it carried serious implications. A bald monarch was viewed with suspicion and even fear. People believed that to lose one's hair was to lose control over one's kingdom, both literally and figuratively. This may seem exaggerated to us today, but in a time when superstition and belief in omens were rampant, it made perfect sense to think that a king's hair could be a reflection of his ability to lead. For the kings, this obsession meant that every tiny detail regarding their hair was monitored closely. Stylists, well, in medieval terms, they were more like personal servants, would be assigned to make sure the royal hair was always perfectly in place. A king's hair had to be thick, long, and gleaming. Any deviation from that could spell disaster. But what happened when the inevitable occurred? What happened when the king's crown started to feel a little emptier? Historians still argue whether the appearance of hair truly impacted the political stability of a kingdom. But it's easy to see why a king might go to such great lengths to avoid it. To lose one's hair was to lose one's power. Let's dive into the strange myths and superstitions that surrounded hair loss in the medieval world. For medieval people, the idea of losing hair wasn't just an aesthetic issue. It was a deeply spiritual one. Hair, especially the hair of a king, was seen as a physical manifestation of power, divine favor, and vitality. To lose it meant much more than just aging. It could signal a fall from grace, a loss of divine protection, or even a curse. Imagine living in a time where the slightest change in your appearance could lead people to question whether the heavens were still on your side. You'd be terrified, right? In the medieval world, these fears ran deep. Kings were often thought to have a direct line to God, or at least to represent God's will on earth. Their hair was seen as an extension of this divine connection, a visible symbol of their strength and authority. When a monarch began to show signs of balding, it wasn't just seen as an unfortunate genetic trait, it was an ominous sign. People believed that if a king lost his hair, it meant he was losing his connection to the divine, which could lead to disaster for the kingdom. Now, here's where things get really interesting. Some of the more paranoid kings turned to supernatural explanations for their thinning locks. They consulted astrologers, mystics, and even witchcraft experts, all hoping to uncover the mysterious cause of their hair loss. Some believed that dark forces were at work, that their enemies were using magic to weaken them. Yes, you heard that right. Hair loss could be blamed on witchcraft. In one particularly famous case, King Henry VIII, notorious for his desperation over his health, even accused his wife, Anne Boleyn, of cursing him when his hair started to thin. Historians still debate how much of this belief in supernatural causes of hair loss was based on reality versus paranoia. But it's clear that for many medieval rulers, the connection between their hair and their power was taken very seriously. Some even believed that the hair itself held magical properties, with the ability to ward off evil or bring good fortune. When a king's hairline began to retreat, it was a sign that the kingdom might be on the brink of misfortune. This fear could spiral into political crises, as rivals would exploit the king's perceived weakness. The supernatural wasn't the only explanation, though. There were also medical beliefs that tied hair loss to other more natural causes. It was commonly thought that stress could lead to hair loss, and given the political turmoil and constant threats to power that kings faced, it's easy to see why they might be particularly vulnerable. Kings were under immense pressure to maintain control, manage wars, and keep their court in line, all of which could take a serious toll on their physical appearance, especially their hair. Imagine living with that constant fear, knowing that every strand of hair lost could signal the downfall of everything you've built. It's hard to escape the pressure when your appearance is tied so closely to your authority. And as we'll see, kings weren't just worried about their hair thinning, they were terrified of being seen as weak or unfit to rule. Now that we've covered the eerie myths and superstitions surrounding hair loss, let's take a closer look at the kingly grooming rituals. These were no simple affairs. Kings in medieval times didn't just let anyone touch their hair. Only the most trusted individuals were allowed the honor. And when it came to maintaining their luscious locks, they had quite the elaborate process to follow. Hair care wasn't just about looking good, it was about maintaining a powerful image. A full, thick head of hair was a crown that didn't need to be worn, but the right rituals had to be followed to keep it intact. For a medieval king, grooming was an all-consuming task. Kings would often have personal servants, sometimes as many as 5 or 6, whose sole job was to care for their hair. The tasks these servants performed weren't just about shampooing or trimming. Oh no, this was much more intricate. They would often employ expensive, specialized oils and concoctions made from rare ingredients like olive oil, honey, and even animal fats, all designed to keep the hair thick and lustrous. These substances were meant to give the hair a glossy sheen, making it appear even healthier than it actually was. A king's hair had to shine, literally. But here's where things get interesting. Some of these treatments were more harmful than helpful. Since medieval medical knowledge wasn't exactly cutting edge, many kings unknowingly subjected their hair to treatments that did more harm than good. For example, some of the oils used were so heavy that they would clog the scalp, causing hair to fall out rather than thrive. Additionally, some treatments involved mixing animal fats with herbs, which, while they may have smelled pleasant, often led to scalp irritation, further contributing to hair loss. The idea of hair loss was so terrifying to medieval monarchs that they would spare no expense when it came to their grooming. It wasn't just about vanity. It was about keeping their kingdom intact. And when you live in a world where your appearance is directly linked to your power, those few extra inches of hair could be the difference between life and death for your reign. Imagine the level of stress this would create for a king constantly watching his hairline, hoping it wouldn't betray him. Some kings, particularly in the later medieval period, even began to use wigs or hairpieces as a way to mask their thinning hair. Wigs, often made from human hair or expensive materials like horsehair, were meticulously crafted to match the king's natural hair color and style. It wasn't just about hiding bald spots, it was about preserving an image of strength. A wig allowed a king to maintain his regal appearance, especially if he had lost his hairline in a less than dignified way. But there's a fascinating contradiction here. While wigs were meant to conceal a king's loss of hair, they were also a sign of weakness. If the public found out that a king was wearing a wig, it could make him seem less powerful, even though it was supposed to enhance his power. This strange tension between appearance and reality played a huge role in how medieval kings navigated their public images. Keeping up the illusion was essential, and sometimes that meant wearing a crown of hair that wasn't entirely real. Historians still argue whether wigs actually helped maintain the king's power, or if they only added to the anxiety. Did the wigs reinforce the illusion of strength, or did they just expose the king's vulnerability to the masses? It's a debate that's still alive today, when we consider how modern politicians, celebrities, and leaders try to control their images. Let's now turn our attention to one of the most deeply rooted fears of medieval kings: baldness. In a time when every detail of a ruler's appearance was scrutinized, losing hair was not just a personal nuisance, it was a political crisis. You see, in medieval Europe, a king's appearance was often considered a direct reflection of his ability to rule. And what better way to reinforce your image of strength and power than a full, thick mane? But when the hair started thinning, it was more than just a cosmetic problem. It was a sign that the king's reign might be in jeopardy, a whisper of weakness that his enemies would surely exploit. Let's talk about what this fear looked like in action. Kings would go to extreme lengths to prevent balding. Some of the more paranoid rulers would consult astrologers to determine if there were any celestial alignments responsible for their hair loss. Others, unable to find a more rational explanation, turned to supernatural means, employing witches or magicians to cast spells that could reverse the damage done by baldness. You might think this sounds like an episode of a fantasy show, but was all too real in the medieval world. And when the king's hairline started to retreat, the pressure mounted. One of the most common beliefs during this time was that baldness was an omen, a sign that the king's power was slipping away. This idea wasn't just a superstition held by the common folk. Even courtiers and high-ranking officials believed it. A bald king wasn't just seen as a ruler losing his physical vitality. He was perceived as losing his grip on the kingdom itself. His health was in question, and by extension, so was his ability to defend the realm. Political rivals would seize on these fears, spreading rumors of the king's decline and suggesting that it was time for a change of leadership. This fear wasn't just personal for the king. it could spark a full-blown political crisis. Imagine being in the shoes of a medieval monarch under constant pressure to maintain the illusion of strength. Baldness wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a potential trigger for rebellion. If a king's hairline retreated too far, he could face losing not only his dignity, but also his throne. The fear of becoming a weak ruler was far more frightening than the prospect of aging itself. So, the king's servants, astrologers, and even court doctors would scramble to find solutions. But here's the thing. Historians still argue whether this fear of baldness was grounded in any real political consequence or if it was simply a reflection of the medieval fixation on outward appearance. Did baldness really lead to the downfall of kings? Or was it more a symbol of their fragility? Either way, the anxiety surrounding hair loss was real, and for many rulers, it was a fear they couldn't escape. One of the more famous cases was that of King Henry VIII. As his hair began to thin, so did his grip on power. While there's no concrete evidence to suggest that his balding directly led to his infamous behavior later in life, it certainly fed into the narrative of decline that surrounded his reign. His paranoia and obsession with maintaining control over his image led him down paths that would ultimately result in scandal, multiple marriages, and a divided kingdom. Whether or not his hair loss contributed to his decisions is up for debate, but it certainly became a focal point for his court's fear and insecurity. In medieval times, these fears weren't confined to kings alone. Even lesser nobles worried about losing their hair. In fact, many common people were more likely to face ridicule and social ostracism if their hair started to thin. This widespread anxiety about baldness wasn't just a royal issue. It was a societal problem. It was a symptom of a culture that tied so much of one's worth to appearance, to the point where even the loss of a few strands of hair could spell disaster. Let's explore the role of medieval medicine in addressing the very real and often imagined problem of hair loss. While kings and noblemen worried about their thinning crowns, they had no shortage of medical professionals eager to offer their solutions. Of course, we're not talking about modern dermatologists or trichologists here. These medieval doctors were a far cry from today's specialists. Their understanding of hair loss, like much else in medicine, was a mix of superstition, guesswork, and trial and error. But that didn't stop them from prescribing all kinds of bizarre treatments in the hopes of restoring the king's youthful mane. One of the most common medieval remedies for hair loss was the application of concoctions made from ingredients like crushed herbs, honey, and animal fats. Some of these ingredients might have had minor beneficial effects on the scalp, but they were hardly the miracle cures the kings were hoping for. In fact, many of these treatments likely contributed to the very problem they were meant to solve. Some of the oils used to treat hair loss were so thick and greasy that they would clog the pores on the scalp, making it even harder for new hair to grow. But that didn't stop the medieval doctors from using them, often at great expense. After all, who wouldn't want to claim that they had the secret to saving a king's hair? Other treatments were even more outlandish. Some medieval healers believed that a person's hair could be restored through the application of animal-based products, things like bull's blood pigeon droppings or even the fat of a freshly slaughtered pig. These treatments, as you can probably imagine, were not only unpleasant, but often ineffective. In one particularly bizarre case, a French nobleman named John II was said to have been prescribed a remedy that involved the use of crushed pearls mixed with wine. While this may sound like something out of a medieval spa day, it wasn't exactly what you'd call a scientific solution. But perhaps the most disturbing treatments involved bloodletting. Yes, in the medieval world, it was believed that one of the causes of hair loss was an imbalance of the body's humors. This idea came from the ancient Greek physician Hippocrates. To correct this imbalance, physicians would often resort to bloodletting, where they would literally drain a person's blood to rebalance their humors. While this practice was used for many ailments, it did nothing to cure baldness. In fact, it may have made things worse by further weakening the patient's body. Still, it was a treatment of choice for many monarchs who were desperate for a solution, even if it didn't quite make sense. As you can imagine, none of these treatments were guaranteed to work, and most didn't. Instead, they often served to exacerbate the situation. But the desperation for a solution was real. A king's hair was far more than just a personal vanity project. It was integral to his rule, his power, and his ability to maintain the kingdom's faith in his leadership. So, these bizarre treatments continued, despite their apparent ineffectiveness, because, well, what else were they supposed to do? And still, historians debate the efficacy of these medieval remedies. Did they work in some rare cases? Probably, but the likelihood of hair restoration through such methods was as slim as a medieval barber surgeon's chance of getting it right. The debate remains. Was it the placebo effect or just wishful thinking? But one thing is clear. Medieval kings would do anything to hold on to their hair, even if it meant slathering their scalps with a mixture of pig fat, pigeon poop, or worse. They were willing to try it all in the hope that their hairline would remain intact. What's fascinating is how these medieval treatments for hair loss compare to modern-day alternatives. The same level of desperation still exists today in the search for miracle cures, whether it's a new treatment or the latest magic potion. While we may have more scientific knowledge now, the desire for perfect hair, especially for public figures, is as intense as ever. Who played a pivotal role in the king's quest to preserve his hair? The barber surgeons. In the medieval world, barbers weren't just the ones trimming beards and cutting hair. No, they were also the unofficial doctors of the day, handling everything from tooth extractions to bloodletting. In fact, the term barber surgeon didn't just refer to a person who worked in a shop with a razor. It was an entire profession, trusted with medical tasks that, in hindsight, probably shouldn't have been left in their hands. For kings and nobles, barber surgeons were often the first line of defense against hair loss. Their expertise wasn't in hair restoration per se, but they were still expected to maintain a ruler's appearance. These men, often with little to no formal medical training, were tasked with everything from trimming royal hair to treating minor ailments. The higher up the royal hierarchy you went, the more your grooming and personal care were in the hands of these barber surgeons. But these barber surgeons didn't just clip hair and offer shampoo advice. In fact, they were heavily involved in the bizarre medical treatments of the time. One of their most dreaded duties was bloodletting, which, as we mentioned earlier, was a widely used remedy for almost any ailment, including baldness. But they also handled more delicate procedures like removing cysts and, in some cases, even performing rudimentary surgeries. All of this was happening with very little understanding of human anatomy. After all, this was medieval medicine we're talking about. Still, these barber surgeons were considered an essential part of the royal court, and kings trusted them to maintain their health and appearance. Barber surgeons also had the unenviable task of advising the king on hair care. Since medieval kings often relied on these professionals to help maintain their image, they'd be the ones making recommendations about hair treatments, grooming routines, and even hairstyles. Imagine being a king with the weight of an entire kingdom on your shoulders, and then having your barber surgeon suggest that you should try a new experimental tonic made from crushed herbs and pig fat. While it might sound absurd now, this was a reality for many rulers who simply wanted to hold on to their hair. What's most intriguing about the relationship between kings and their barber surgeons is how much these professionals influenced the king's sense of self. Kings were often so preoccupied with their image and appearance that they'd place their trust in anyone who could offer a solution, even if that solution was as outlandish as using animal fat to prevent baldness. It wasn't just about physical appearance. The king's image was everything. And in a time where superstition ruled the day, a barber surgeon might have been the one person a king turned to when his hairline started to retreat. Historians still debate the exact level of influence barber surgeons had over the royal court. Some believe they were just minor figures in the grand scheme of things, while others argue that these individuals held a surprising amount of sway. Could a single barber surgeon, with his knowledge of medieval remedies, really determine the fate of a king's reign? Well, it's not so far-fetched. After all, if a king's hair loss was seen as a sign of weakness, then the person tasked with addressing that weakness could be playing a pivotal role in the ruler's image, and, by extension, in the political stability of the kingdom. The barber surgeon wasn't just trimming hair, they were shaping the king's very legacy. As you can see, the role of the barber surgeon was more significant than it might seem at first glance. These individuals were trusted with the king's appearance, health, and image, making them far more influential than we might have ever imagined. And considering how much pressure medieval kings were under to maintain their image, it's no wonder that they sought out every possible remedy, no matter how ridiculous or dangerous, to preserve their hair. As we've explored the world of royal grooming and the efforts kings made to preserve their hair, let's now delve into the symbolism of royal accessories, specifically crowns and hats, and how they played a crucial role in concealing a thinning mane. For medieval kings, a crown wasn't just an ornament. It was a symbol of divine right and strength. But what happens when the crown wasn't the only thing that needed to be worn? When the king's hair started to falter, those regal headpieces became even more essential. For centuries, the crown was the ultimate symbol of a monarch's power. But when a king began to experience hair loss, it became less of a symbol of power and more of a cover-up tool. Imagine a king walking into his court with a receding hairline exposed for all to see. The crown was no longer just a sign of royalty. It became an indispensable shield for protecting his image. This wasn't just about covering up a bad hair day. A well-placed crown could save a monarch from the perception of weakness. Whether it was a coronation crown or a more casual piece of headgear, it allowed the king to maintain the illusion of strength, even if he was struggling to keep his hairline intact. Interestingly, the use of crowns and hats as a means of covering up hair loss was not unique to the medieval period. Monarchs in earlier periods, particularly the ancient Egyptians and Greeks, used elaborate headpieces to signify power while also keeping their hair hidden from view. But in the medieval era, the stakes were even higher. Kings were constantly under the scrutiny of their subjects and courtiers, and any sign of vulnerability could be exploited by political rivals. To truly understand the importance of these accessories, we need to look at the role of the headgear in medieval society. Kings weren't the only ones wearing these headpieces. Nobles and high-ranking officials also wore elaborate hats and headdresses, often to signify their status. But for the king, the crown was an almost sacred item. It was the one piece of regalia that had to be worn at all times during public appearances, and it was a symbol of both his authority and his divine favor. As his hair began to thin, it wasn't just vanity that made him continue wearing it. The crown was a powerful tool to maintain the perception of invincibility. But not all crowns were designed to fit the king's head perfectly. In fact, many of the medieval crowns were designed to be large and cumbersome, often sitting a little too high on the head. This wasn't just for decoration. It was meant to create an image of grandeur and height, signaling the king's superiority. But when a king started to lose his hair, the size and positioning of the crown could actually draw attention to his thinning scalp, making it all the more important to position it just right. This delicate balancing act of maintaining both the crown's symbolic power and concealing a receding hairline must have caused considerable stress. Hats were also part of the royal arsenal for dealing with hair loss. For kings who didn't want to wear a crown at all times, a carefully chosen hat could be just as effective in hiding their thinning hair. Medieval headgear ranged from simple, elegant crowns to more complex hoods and headdresses, often adorned with jewels, fur, or feathers. These hats were designed not only for warmth or fashion, but as essential elements of a king's public persona. They had to fit seamlessly into the royal image, hiding any imperfections while still allowing the king to appear as powerful and regal as ever. Historians still debate whether the crown's role as a cover for hair loss was universally accepted in medieval times. Some argue that because of the highly ritualized nature of medieval kingship, a monarch's appearance was dictated by tradition, and so the crown's role as a mask would have been unquestioned. Others contend that the king's personal anxiety about his appearance may have contributed more to the crown's symbolism than any collective belief. Either way, the crown served a double purpose, both as a visible symbol of power and as a means of concealing vulnerability. The fact remains that a king's image was everything. In the medieval world, appearance and perception could make or break a ruler's reign. The crown, once a symbol of authority, became an even more powerful tool for maintaining that image, especially as the king's hairline began to betray him. And even though we may look at these practices with a sense of humor or disbelief today, it's important to remember how much of a monarch's life was tied to his public perception. The crown wasn't just a shiny accessory, it was a necessary shield. Now that we've explored the role of crowns and hats as a means to conceal the thinning hair of medieval kings, let's take a step back and examine how other cultures viewed hair and how their beliefs influenced medieval European rulers. Hair, as we've discussed, was not just an aesthetic concern, it was a powerful symbol of leadership, vitality, and divine favor. However, in other parts of the world, the symbolic role of hair was just as significant, if not more so. The medieval European obsession with hair was part of a broader global tradition where hair was linked to power, and kings from different cultures also faced similar anxieties about their hairlines. In ancient Egypt, for example, pharaohs were known to wear elaborate wigs, which were not merely fashion statements but were deeply symbolic. The pharaoh's wig represented both divine authority and the ideal image of power. The Egyptians believed that their gods had perfect, untouchable appearances, and the wig, often crafted from human hair or plant fibers, was a tool used to emulate the god's perfection. It's interesting to note that just like medieval kings, Egyptian rulers did not necessarily want their natural hair to be visible to the public. Instead, they preferred wigs to symbolize their connection to the divine and to enhance their regal image. In fact, a well-maintained wig in ancient Egypt was a direct reflection of the pharaoh's ability to rule effectively. If his wig was messy or disheveled, it would have been seen as a sign of instability or loss of favor from the gods. Similarly, in ancient Greece, hair had a significant cultural and political role. Greek warriors were often depicted with long flowing hair, symbolizing their strength, virility, and warrior prowess. Kings and generals in Greece wore their hair long to emphasize their power and to demonstrate that they were in the prime of their lives. Losing hair was viewed as a sign of aging or weakness, which could have serious political consequences. Much like the medieval monarchs, Greek rulers faced a public pressure to maintain their youthful appearance, especially as their hair began to thin. It's no surprise that these societies too sought out various remedies for hair loss, many of which involved herbs and magical treatments, similar to those found in medieval Europe. In India, especially in the courts of the Mughal Empire, hair also carried great significance. Mughal emperors were known for their long, well-groomed beards and thick hair, which were seen as symbols of strength, wisdom, and leadership. For these rulers, facial hair was just as important as the hair on their heads. The grooming rituals surrounding hair were elaborate, and the appearance of a ruler's beard or hair was a reflection of their royal dignity. Kings who started to lose their hair were often seen as losing their potency and might. As with medieval European kings, the fear of hair loss was linked to the broader fear of losing one's grip on power. Across all these cultures, the symbolism of hair remained strikingly similar. Whether it was a crown in Europe, a wig in Egypt, or long flowing locks in Greece, hair represented strength, virility, and leadership. Losing it, therefore, was not just an issue of vanity, it was an existential crisis for any ruler. When you live in a world where your every action and appearance is under constant scrutiny, losing hair can feel like losing everything. This connection between hair and power was not only a medieval phenomenon, but one that spanned cultures and centuries. It's interesting to consider how these diverse cultural beliefs about hair might have shaped the medieval European monarchy. The idea of hair as a symbol of power wasn't unique to any one culture. Rather, it was a shared belief that transcended borders. The medieval European king, with his fear of losing his hair, was not an isolated case but part of a broader human tradition that spanned time and geography. The fact that these rulers across different cultures all struggled with the same issue, how to preserve their hair and their power, suggests that the anxiety around hair loss is not just a historical curiosity, but a deeply ingrained human fear. Historians still debate whether the pressure to maintain a youthful appearance actually affected the political stability of these kingdoms. Did a king's thinning hair lead to actual rebellion or revolt? Or was it simply a reflection of the broader anxieties that rulers had about their image and public perception? Some argue that the psychological toll of fearing baldness was enough to lead to bad decisions, while others believe it was more about the symbolic importance of hair, which could influence public opinion in subtle ways. Whatever the answer, it's clear that hair has always been far more than just something to groom. Now that we've explored how different cultures viewed the symbolism of hair and its impact on their rulers, let's zoom in on a particularly intriguing aspect of royal life: how hair directly influenced royal marriages and political alliances. Hair, as we've seen, was a marker of power and vitality. And what better way to solidify a monarch's strength than by securing a marriage that reinforced both personal and political power? But as we'll soon discover, a king's hairline, or lack thereof, could play a surprisingly significant role in the world of royal unions. In the medieval world, royal marriages were not just about love or personal affection. They were carefully orchestrated affairs designed to strengthen alliances, solidify power, and maintain political stability. Kings married for power, territory, and influence, and hair, whether a thick mane or a thinning scalp, often played an unexpected part in these negotiations. If a king's hairline was receding, it could be seen as a sign of aging or even a lack of virility, which could pose a problem when it came to producing heirs. After all, one of the main purposes of a royal marriage was to secure the future of the dynasty. If a king's appearance indicated that he was no longer in his prime, it might raise concerns about his ability to father heirs or even rule effectively. Imagine being a young princess, standing at the altar, ready to marry a powerful king. Your father, the king of a neighboring kingdom, has made this marriage arrangement to secure his political future. You're poised to marry the ruler of a vast land. But there's just one problem: his thinning hair. It may seem trivial, but in medieval society, such concerns were taken seriously. A king's hair, or lack thereof, could cast doubts on his ability to lead or to secure the future of his family. A bald king wasn't just someone aging, he was someone potentially on the brink of political instability. This could lead to an interesting paradox. Despite being the most powerful person in the kingdom, the king's own hairline could make him seem weak and vulnerable. There are several historical examples where the hair of kings played a role in marriage negotiations. Take, for instance, the marriage of King Richard II of England and Anne of Bohemia. Richard, who ascended to the throne at a young age, was known for his good looks and youthful appearance, an image that was crucial in his early reign. However, as he grew older, Richard's appearance became less regal. His image began to shift, and rumors about his weakening rule circulated. Historians speculate that the political instability that came with Richard's later reign, combined with his changing appearance, contributed to his eventual downfall. Could his later baldness and the public perception of it have played a role in undermining his authority? It's a question that's still debated. Another fascinating example is that of King Louis XIII of France. Louis, who ascended to the throne in his childhood, was often depicted as a handsome and youthful monarch. However, as he reached adulthood, his hairline began to recede, and his appearance began to show signs of aging. This didn't sit well with his political advisors, and there were even whispers in the court that his physical decline mirrored a loss of power. Louis's marriage to Anne of Austria was partly orchestrated to strengthen France's position in European politics. But the state of his health, particularly his thinning hair, was a matter of concern for his advisors. It wasn't just about his ability to father heirs, it was also about maintaining a strong image of the monarchy. A king who showed signs of weakness in his appearance could be seen as vulnerable to internal and external challenges. The interesting thing about these royal marriages is that the appearance of hair often became a hidden variable in what was otherwise a calculated political equation. Hair was no longer just about beauty. It was a currency in the royal world, used to broker power and security. The political ramifications of hair loss in these royal unions were real, and it's possible that the pressure on kings to maintain their image extended far beyond vanity. It was a matter of dynasty, legacy, and power. Historians still argue whether the concern over hair loss in royal marriages was purely superficial or whether it had more profound political implications. Was it just an image issue, or did it directly affect the king's ability to rule effectively? Some argue that the connection between appearance and power was too strong to ignore. After all, a monarch's image was a key part of their authority. Others contend that royal marriages were simply so politically driven that a ruler's thinning hair was unlikely to have much bearing on the larger strategy. Either way, it's clear that the image of hair loss in kings wasn't just a private concern. It was a very public, politically charged issue. As we explore further into the world of medieval monarchs and their hair concerns, let's now focus on the role of superstitions and omens tied to a king's hair. For medieval rulers, the belief in omens and supernatural signs was deeply embedded in the culture, and a king's physical appearance, including his hair, was not exempt from this mystical worldview. In fact, hair loss itself was often interpreted as a sign of something more significant, something that could affect not only the king's reign, but the fate of the kingdom as a whole. In the medieval period, superstitions were rampant, and everything from a bird's flight to a child's sneeze could be seen as an omen of something greater. Hair was no exception. Kings were seen as the living embodiment of divine favor, chosen by God to rule. Therefore, any imperfection in their physical form could be interpreted as a direct challenge to that divine right. If a king's hair began to fall out, it was seen by many as an ominous sign that the king's power was waning, that perhaps even God's favor was slipping away. This belief was so widespread that kings, even with their immense power, would sometimes turn to astrologers, mystics, or wise men to help them decipher these signs. For example, when King Henry VIII of England began to show signs of aging, including hair loss, it wasn't just about vanity. Many of his contemporaries believed that his physical decline was a sign that his reign was in trouble. Of course, Henry's personal life and political decisions would soon reflect this, with his multiple marriages and the turbulent religious shifts he instigated. But could his hair loss have been interpreted as a divine warning that things were about to change? Historians have speculated that Henry, paranoid about his health, turned to astrology and even magic to stave off his fears about his physical appearance. The king's hair loss became more than just an aging process. It became a symbol of instability. Similarly, the fall of King Charles II of England is often attributed to his weakening health and appearance, particularly his thinning hair and the frailty that accompanied it. It's said that as he grew older and his hairline receded, Charles became more and more concerned about the appearance of his monarchy. His hair loss was interpreted as a sign of the monarchy's own decline. While the political factors surrounding his reign were much more complex, many believed that the king's weakening appearance was an omen that the monarchy would eventually lose its grip on power. Historians continue to argue whether these superstitions were based on reality or if they were simply an expression of medieval anxiety about power and divine favor. Did a king's physical appearance truly have a supernatural effect on the fate of his reign, or was it simply a way for people to make sense of the political turbulence they witnessed? The supernatural explanation for hair loss may seem far-fetched today, but in the medieval period, where belief in omens and the power of the divine was widespread, it made perfect sense that a king's hair could carry such weight. One particularly interesting aspect of this supernatural connection to hair loss was the role of the court's clergy. Priests and bishops who held considerable sway in medieval courts often provided counsel to kings regarding these omens. When a ruler's hair began to thin, the clergy might interpret this as a spiritual warning. The hair of the king, after all, was often seen as a reflection of his moral and spiritual state. If a king's hair was falling out, it could be viewed as a sign that he was no longer in God's favor, a belief that was deeply troubling for a monarch who relied on divine right to govern. Historians still debate the significance of these superstitions. Some argue that the fear of hair loss and the corresponding omens were a reflection of the medieval understanding of kingship itself. Others believe that this superstition played a much more practical role in how medieval monarchs managed their public image. Either way, the belief that hair could carry divine weight was deeply embedded in the political and cultural landscape of the time. Today, we might scoff at the idea that a king's hairline could dictate the fate of his reign, but in the medieval world, where every detail of a monarch's life was scrutinized, even the smallest sign of vulnerability could be seen as a harbinger of change. And so, it wasn't just about hair loss. It was about what that loss symbolized. A king's thinning hair was a visible manifestation of the fragility of power. A reminder. Now, let's take a step back and look at how the concept of hair loss played into the overall perception of royal health during the medieval period. As we've seen, hair loss was often linked to weakness, aging, and a potential loss of divine favor. But what if we expand our view to look at how health, in general, was perceived in medieval kingship? Physical strength, vitality, and appearance weren't just indicators of a ruler's age, they were seen as direct markers of his ability to rule. If a king began to look sickly, it wasn't just a personal issue, it was a political one. Imagine you're living in a medieval kingdom, and you rely on the king to lead you through war, famine, and disease. If your king starts to look frail, you might start to wonder whether he has the strength to protect you. You're not the only one thinking this. The king's advisors, his courtiers, and his enemies are all watching closely, noticing every sign of wear and tear on his body. A king's health, whether physical, mental, or emotional, was directly tied to the fate of the kingdom. A ruler who was weak or unwell was vulnerable, and in a time where political instability was just one assassination away, that weakness could be exploited. For medieval monarchs, this fear of looking weak was an ongoing concern. As we've discussed, hair loss was one of the most visible signs of this. But there were other physical ailments that could reveal a king's fragility. For instance, a king who began to show signs of illness, such as frequent coughing or a pale complexion, would be seen as less fit to rule. Kings who suffered from chronic illnesses or who appeared gaunt and sickly were often looked at with suspicion. If you are a nobleman, it's in your best interest to make sure the king remains strong. If the king is visibly weakening, you might begin to question his ability to protect your interests. Interestingly, medieval monarchs, who relied on their image for political stability, were also concerned with the appearance of their health. A good king, in the eyes of the public, was one who exuded physical strength, vitality, and, above all, the ability to lead by example. If a king looked ill, there were serious concerns that he might be losing his grip on power. This fear wasn't unfounded either. Monarchs who looked frail or unwell could be seen as vulnerable to attack or revolt. Their physical condition was a reflection of their mental and emotional state, And in the medieval mind, a weak ruler was a dangerous ruler. For instance, the case of King John of England provides an excellent example of how health and appearance were tightly interwoven with a ruler's public image. John, often considered one of England's weakest kings, had a troubled reign that was marked by poor decision-making and a lack of political skill. But John's physical health was also in question during his reign. He was described as overweight, which, in a time when physical fitness was associated with strength, this became an additional point of criticism. His appearance didn't inspire confidence, and this lack of physical vitality was often connected to his poor leadership. Historians debate the extent to which his personal health influenced the perception of his rule, but it's clear that, in the medieval world, a king's body was seen as a reflection of his authority. The king's image, therefore, wasn't just about looking powerful. It was about projecting the strength necessary to keep the kingdom together. Physical weakness, whether caused by aging, illness, or hair loss, could be interpreted as a signal that the king was unfit to lead, and this could have far-reaching consequences. Monarchs understood that their health was a reflection of their power, and thus they went to great lengths to maintain a healthy, robust image. They wore the finest clothes, followed complex grooming rituals, and maintained their hair, because their appearance was an integral part of their ability to rule. In the context of hair loss, this means that a king's thinning hair wasn't just an inconvenient aspect of aging. It was a symbol of his declining power. And in a world where monarchy was still seen as divinely ordained, the loss of hair could be interpreted as a sign that the king was losing favor with God. It's a fascinating window into how medieval kings and their courtiers viewed the connection between physical strength and political power. Historians still debate how much a king's health directly affected his reign, but one thing is clear: image was everything. Whether it was through hair, posture, or appearance, medieval kings had to constantly maintain the illusion of strength, vitality, and divine favor. A king who couldn't hold on to his health, whether it was due to age or something more sinister, was a king who risked losing everything. As we continue this exploration into the strange and fascinating world of medieval monarchs, let's take a closer look at the bizarre and often absurd cosmetic solutions kings turned to in their desperate efforts to stave off hair loss. Now, when we think of medieval medicine, we often imagine strange remedies that sound more like something from a dark fairy tale than actual treatments. And yet, the lengths that kings were willing to go to in order to preserve their hair were far from a simple vanity project. These cosmetic solutions were tied directly to the king's image, and any perceived weakness, whether it was a thinning crown or a frail appearance, could be exploited by political rivals. So, what kind of hair restoration treatments were these monarchs using? Well, prepare yourself, because the medieval world didn't just rely on hair tonics. They had some truly peculiar practices when it came to maintaining a regal mane. One of the most popular and quite frankly horrifying treatments was the use of crushed herbs and animal fats. These were often mixed into thick pastes or oils, which would then be massaged into the scalp to promote hair growth. Of course, the scientific basis for these treatments was practically non-existent, but that didn't stop kings and their royal advisors from swearing by them. The idea behind using animal fat was that it would provide the scalp with the nourishment it supposedly lacked, though the reality was that it probably did little more than clog up pores and irritate the skin. But the truly strange part was when these treatments got even more bizarre. Some kings, desperate to hold on to their youthful appearance, resorted to methods that could only be described as medieval miracle cures. In one particularly outlandish case, a king's court doctor recommended a mixture of crushed pearls and wine to be applied to the scalp. Now, if you're thinking that crushed pearls might add a touch of luxury to a remedy, you'd be right. But in reality, this treatment likely did nothing to restore hair. The reasoning behind using pearls was tied to their association with purity and beauty. But unfortunately, no amount of sparkling pearls could reverse a receding hairline. Another popular but equally questionable treatment involved the use of urine. Yes, you heard that right. Some medieval texts suggested that applying a mixture of urine and vinegar could promote hair growth. The rationale? Well, urine was believed to have cleansing properties and vinegar was thought to purify the scalp. While the combination might have been effective for cleaning hair or even removing some oil, it was hardly a proven hair restoration method. This was just one of many bizarre, often uncomfortable remedies that kings were willing to try to maintain their appearance. Then, of course, we can't forget the infamous hair-restoring potions that promised miraculous results. These concoctions were often made from a mix of herbs, oils, and spices, and they would be sold by traveling apothecaries to anyone desperate enough to try them. While these potions were rarely effective, they were often sold for exorbitant prices to the royal court, where the desire for a full head of hair outweighed any concern for scientific credibility. These treatments often included ingredients that were not only ineffective but potentially dangerous, with some even claiming that exotic herbs from distant lands could cure hair loss by somehow revitalizing the body's vital spirits. While these cosmetic solutions might seem laughable in modern times, they were not just vanity projects for medieval kings. They were desperate measures taken in a high-stakes political environment. The image of the king, especially in times of war or political unrest, was paramount. A king who looked frail or weak, who showed signs of aging or illness, risked appearing unfit to rule. A king's appearance could be as important as his military strategy or his alliances. If his hair began to thin, his political enemies might seize on that vulnerability, questioning his vitality and his ability to protect the kingdom. So, these miracle cures were not simply a reflection of royal vanity. They were a survival tactic. In the medieval period, a monarch's reign could end just as easily through public perception as it could through assassination or betrayal. In a world where the physical body of the king was so closely tied to the strength and stability of the kingdom, preserving the king's appearance was a matter of national importance. Historians still debate the extent to which these bizarre cosmetic solutions actually had any impact on a monarch's appearance. Did these treatments work, even a little, or were they nothing more than an elaborate exercise in self-deception? Some argue that the placebo effect, believing that something will work because you want it to, might have played a role. Others suggest that these treatments were purely symbolic, helping to maintain the image of strength and vitality even when the king's body was beginning to betray him. Either way, these treatments show just how far monarchs were willing to go to preserve their image and how much their appearance was tied to their political survival. Let's now turn our attention to a topic that ties together the themes we've explored so far: the strange world of medieval royal cosmetics and their connection to gender roles. In the world of kings and queens, the image they projected was not solely about power and strength. It was also about maintaining their sexual and social appeal. As we've seen, a king's hair was not just a personal trait. It was a symbol of his vitality, virility, and ability to rule. But this pressure to look youthful and powerful wasn't just restricted to kings. The roles that hair played in the lives of queens and noblewomen were just as significant. In fact, the relationship between hair, gender, and royal image is a fascinating lens through which we can understand how the medieval court was structured. Kings, particularly those who were concerned with the optics of their reign, often viewed their appearance as a tool for maintaining control over the court, the nobility, and their subjects. In a way, A king's hair functioned as a public symbol of masculinity, strength, and fertility. A full head of hair signified a powerful ruler capable of protecting the kingdom, fathering heirs, and maintaining the dynasty. The fear of losing one's hair was, therefore, much more than just a personal anxiety. It was a deep-seated concern about appearing weak or unfit to rule. But when we consider queens and noblewomen, we see a completely different dynamic. While they too were concerned with the preservation of their beauty and appearance, their societal pressures were tied more to their perceived femininity and the importance of producing heirs for the monarchy. Royal women, unlike their male counterparts, had to navigate a complex set of expectations regarding their appearance, often feeling the pressure to maintain not only their beauty but also their fertility. Hair was tied directly to this concept of femininity. Thick, flowing hair was associated with youth, vitality, and the ability to bear children. If a queen's hair began to thin or fall out, it could be seen as a sign of her inability to fulfill her duty as a wife and mother. It's no surprise then that many women in royal families underwent elaborate hair care rituals in an attempt to stave off these fears. But what's even more interesting is how these gender expectations manifested in the actions of both kings and queens. In medieval Europe, while kings used their physical strength and their hair to assert dominance, queens were tasked with upholding a different set of ideals. They had to maintain their beauty, to be seen as desirable to their husbands, and in doing so, they reinforced the image of themselves as the ideal feminine counterpart to the king. These gendered expectations about appearance were reinforced through every facet of court life, from marriage arrangements to diplomatic alliances, from attire to hairstyles. There's also the fascinating reality of how these gendered roles played out in the lives of women within royal courts. For instance, Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most influential women of the medieval period, had a famously striking appearance that was said to have been central to her political power. Known for her beauty and charm, she also became a figurehead for how women navigated their roles in medieval society. Eleanor maintained her image carefully, understanding the power of her beauty and the importance of her hair as a symbol of fertility and royalty. In her time, a queen who failed to uphold her beauty could jeopardize her marriage and, by extension, her political influence. But what about the monarchs who were not as fortunate in their appearance? As we've seen, kings like Henry VIII of England, with his thinning hair and fluctuating weight, suffered from the public's critical eye. But let's also take a closer look at the influence of queens whose hair, or lack thereof, shaped their place in history. For instance, Queen Catherine de' Medici, though often described as a woman of great intelligence and political skill, was also burdened by the constant pressure to maintain an immaculate appearance. Despite her brilliance, Catherine's image as a queen was often scrutinized, not only because of her political maneuverings, but also due to the expectations surrounding her beauty. The contrast between the experiences of male and female rulers in medieval times speaks volumes about how hair, appearance, and gender were intertwined in the royal court. While a king's hair was a symbol of power and vitality, a queen's hair was tied to her feminine allure and her ability to produce heirs. Both faced tremendous pressure to maintain their image. But for queens, the stakes were even higher. A queen's hair loss wasn't just a physical ailment. It was an indictment of her ability to perform her primary role in the eyes of the court and the kingdom. In the medieval period, a woman's worth in the royal family was often seen as directly linked to her beauty, fertility, and ability to produce heirs. If her appearance began to show signs of decay, it could signal a loss of influence, not just in the court, but in the kingdom as well. Historians still argue about the weight of these expectations on royal women, but one thing is certain. hair played a significant role in shaping how both men and women navigated their royal duties. For kings, hair was a symbol of power, masculinity, and dominance. For queens, it was a symbol of beauty, fertility, and femininity. Both had to manage their appearance in the public eye, lest they risk losing the very image that helped secure their reign. As we move deeper into the psyche of medieval kings and queens and their concerns over hair, let's focus now on the real-world consequences of a king's hair loss, namely, how it could influence the very course of history. This is where the tension between appearance and political power becomes most apparent. While hair loss was a personal issue, it also had far-reaching political consequences. We've already touched on how monarchs feared the vulnerability that came with a receding hairline. But let's now examine some actual historical examples to see how these anxieties played out on the world stage. One of the most famous cases of hair loss and its political ramifications was that of King Henry VIII of England. We've discussed his many marriages, but there's more to his story than just the drama of the Tudor court. Henry VIII's fear of aging and his constant worry about his physical appearance were intricately tied to his political actions. As his hairline receded and his waistline expanded, Henry became more and more desperate to maintain the image of virility that had once defined his reign. His obsession with his hair and his appearance wasn't just about self-image. It was about his ability to rule. In the case of Henry VIII, hair loss had tangible effects on his decision-making. His anxiety about aging led to his infamous break with the Roman Catholic Church, a decision that forever altered the course of English history. Historians still debate whether Henry's fear of losing his youthful vitality was a driving force behind his desire for a divorce from Catherine of Aragon and his subsequent marriages. What's clear is that as his physical health deteriorated, his grip on reason began to slip as well. His obsession with producing a male heir, despite already having a daughter, was fueled by his belief that a son would affirm his continued virility. The idea that his appearance and his ability to father children were tied to his political legitimacy contributed directly to his downfall. Another example comes from the reign of King Charles II of England. Charles, who became king after the English Civil War, was famous for his charisma and his romantic affairs. However, as he aged and began to lose his hair, he too became deeply concerned with his appearance. Charles's long, flowing hair was not just a symbol of youth and beauty. It was a part of the image of royal grandeur he worked so hard to maintain. As his hairline receded, so did his public confidence. The king, who had once been adored for his charm and wit, became increasingly paranoid about his physical decline. The paranoia over his image, combined with his declining health, may have contributed to some of his more erratic political decisions. The fear of hair loss and the political consequences of appearing weak also permeated the courts of Europe, where many monarchs turned to desperate measures to preserve their image. In France, King Louis XIV, also known as the Sun King, was famed for his elaborate wigs and carefully managed appearance. Louis, who ascended to the throne as a young man, was conscious of the need to project an image of strength and youthful vitality. As he grew older and began to lose his hair, he turned to wigs as a way to cover his thinning scalp. The wigs weren't just about vanity. They were part of a carefully constructed image of invincibility that Louis needed to maintain to keep control over his court. His long reign depended on his ability to maintain that image of strength, which was so intimately tied to his physical appearance. It's fascinating to think about the political implications of hair loss in these monarchs' lives. When we examine their decisions, whether it's Henry's break from Rome, Charles's paranoia, or Louis's obsession with his wigs, it's clear that the fear of losing their hair was not merely about aesthetics. For these kings, their hair was more than just a personal trait. It was a symbol of their strength, power, and even divine right to rule. If their hair started to fade, so too did their authority. The pressure to maintain a youthful appearance was intertwined with their very legitimacy as rulers. And in a world where perception often outweighed reality, losing that perception of vitality could lead to disastrous consequences. This fear of hair loss was not limited to just the personal lives of kings. It permeated the political landscape. A monarch who showed visible signs of aging, especially through hair loss, was seen as less fit to rule. The public's perception of their king could shift dramatically, and in a time when political alliances were fragile and rebellion was always a possibility, any sign of weakness was immediately exploited. The rulers who understood this dynamic, like Henry VIII and Louis XIV, were the ones who went to great lengths to maintain their public image, whether through wigs, potions, or in Henry's case, radical political decisions. Historians still argue about the specific influence of hair loss on these monarchs' decision-making processes. But one thing is certain: the anxiety about hair loss wasn't just a personal issue for these rulers. It was deeply tied to their power and their perception of self-worth. In a world where a king's appearance was directly linked to his authority, losing one's hair was seen as a sign of losing control, both over one's body and over the kingdom itself. As we move deeper into the psyche of medieval kings and queens and their concerns over hair, let's focus now on the real-world consequences of a king's hair loss, namely, how it could influence the very course of history. This is where the tension between appearance and political power becomes most apparent. While hair loss was a personal issue, it also had far-reaching political consequences. We've already touched on how monarchs feared the vulnerability that came with a receding hairline, but let's now examine some actual historical examples to see how these anxieties played out on the world stage. One of the most famous cases of hair loss and its political ramifications was that of King Henry VIII of England. We've discussed his many marriages, but there's more to his story than just the drama of the Tudor court. Henry VIII's fear of aging and his constant worry about his physical appearance were intricately tied to his political actions. As his hairline receded and his waistline expanded, Henry became more and more desperate to maintain the image of virility that had once defined his reign. His obsession with his hair and his appearance wasn't just about self-image, it was about his ability to rule. In the case of Henry VIII, hair loss had tangible effects on his decision-making. His anxiety about aging led to his infamous break with the Roman Catholic Church, a decision that forever altered the course of English history. Historians still debate whether Henry's fear of losing his youthful vitality was a driving force behind his desire for a divorce from Catherine of Aragon and his subsequent marriages. What's clear is that as his physical health deteriorated, his grip on reason began to slip as well. His obsession with producing a male heir, despite already having a daughter, was fueled by his belief that a son would affirm his continued virility. The idea that his appearance and his ability to father children were tied to his political legitimacy contributed directly to his downfall. Another example comes from the reign of King Charles II of England. Charles, who became king after the English Civil War, was famous for his charisma and his romantic affairs. However, as he aged and began to lose his hair, he too became deeply concerned with his appearance. Charles's long, flowing hair was not just a symbol of youth and beauty. It was a part of the image of royal grandeur he worked so hard to maintain. As his hairline receded, so did his public confidence. The king, who had once been adored for his charm and wit, became increasingly paranoid about his physical decline. The paranoia over his image combined with his declining health, may have contributed to some of his more erratic political decisions. The fear of hair loss and the political consequences of appearing weak also permeated the courts of Europe, where many monarchs turned to desperate measures to preserve their image. In France, King Louis XIV, also known as the Sun King, was famed for his elaborate wigs and carefully managed appearance. Louis, who ascended to the throne as a young man, was conscious of the need to project an image of strength and youthful vitality. As he grew older and began to lose his hair, he turned to wigs as a way to cover his thinning scalp. The wigs weren't just about vanity. They were part of a carefully constructed image of invincibility that Louis needed to maintain to keep control over his court. His long reign depended on his ability to maintain that image of strength, which was so intimately tied to his physical appearance. It's fascinating to think about the political implications of hair loss in these monarchs' lives. When we examine their decisions, whether it's Henry's break from Rome, Charles's paranoia, or Louis's obsession with his wigs, it's clear that the fear of losing their hair was not merely about aesthetics. For these kings, their hair was more than just a personal trait. It was a symbol of their strength, power, and even divine right to rule. If their hair started to fade, so too did their authority. The pressure to maintain a youthful appearance was intertwined with their very legitimacy as rulers, and in a world where perception often outweighed reality, losing that perception of vitality could lead to disastrous consequences. This fear of hair loss was not limited to just the personal lives of kings. It permeated the political landscape. A monarch who showed visible signs of aging, especially through hair loss, was seen as less fit to rule. The public's perception of their king could shift dramatically, and in a time when political alliances were fragile and rebellion was always a possibility, any sign of weakness was immediately exploited. The rulers who understood this dynamic, like Henry VIII and Louis XIV, were the ones who went to great lengths to maintain their public image, whether through wigs, potions, or, in Henry's case, radical political decisions. Historians still argue about the specific influence of hair loss on these monarchs' decision-making processes. But one thing is certain. The anxiety about hair loss wasn't just a personal issue for these rulers. It was deeply tied to their power and their perception of self-worth. In a world where a king's appearance was directly linked to his authority, losing one's hair was seen as a sign of losing control, both over one's body and over the kingdom itself.